Hello, my name is Sarah Jane Haney, and this is my Module 12 case study. Okay, so Section 1 was a summary of the case. So I'm going to start with who. The people involved in this case study included Mrs. Stevens, the principal, Mrs. Stevens' students, the superintendent, and potentially the teachers' union could get involved. When did this situation occur? It occurred during the school day, and then after school they also had some meetings, and it occurred over about a span of a week. Where it occurred at the school, probably in Mrs. Stevens' classroom when he was observing, and then also in the principal's office when they met. So I'll briefly go over what happened. So the principal was completing teacher evaluations based off classroom observations. The principal noticed Mrs. Stevens was having a difficult time with engaging students each time he was in the classroom. On Thursday, the principal completed a post-evaluation conference with Mrs. Stevens, and she was not taking the feedback very well. On Monday, the principal visited Mrs. Stevens' classroom once more before submitting her evaluation to the superintendent. The following day, the principal met with Mrs. Stevens to review her evaluation, and she was upset by the evaluation and threatened to take the issue to court. Section 2 is focused on reporting legal and ethical issues. I'm going to move me down here. So some of the legal issues that could arise is if Mrs. Stevens takes action against the district regarding her contract non-renewal. So that could eventually become a legal issue. Ethical issues based on Mrs. Stevens' reaction to the evaluation. The principal may be faced with an ethical conflict in regards to whether the evaluation should be submitted as he has it or not. So Section 3 was a one-sentence synthesis of what happened. I said Mrs. Stevens is upset regarding her classroom observation evaluation, the lack of support she believes she has had, and that the principal plans to recommend that her contract should not be renewed for the following year. So then Section 4 focused on the synthesis of the facts. So the people involved, again, are Mrs. Stevens' students. They are disengaged in Mrs. Stevens' lecture approach to teaching. Mrs. Stevens herself, she's a teacher with poor evaluation performance and could receive tenure if she was provided a favorable recommendation. The principal, who's the only one who observed Mrs. Stevens' class and completed her evaluation. The superintendent, who receives Mrs. Stevens' evaluation, and the local teacher union, which may become involved if there's a contractual issue. So, some information about the program. The program details regarding this case study are unknown. We weren't provided too many details in the case study. The place, same situation. The physical location details regarding this case study are also unknown. So, Section 5 focused on reviewing and prioritizing the information. So the stakeholders in this situation include the principal, Mrs. Stevens, the superintendent, and Mrs. Stevens' students. If Mrs. Stevens is not teaching effectively, the children's education will suffer. The situation and the decision made could impact the relationship between Mrs. Stevens, other teachers, and the principal. The superintendent should be made aware of the situation prior to the principal making any more decisions. I think it would be helpful to learn more about Mrs. Stevens' previous evaluations, as well as what professional learning opportunities she's been given and how well she's engaged in this learning in the past. I think that would give better insight into how she is as a teacher prior to this school year. I think it would also be helpful to know how her students behave in other classrooms, as well as what their individual needs are, and if Mrs. Stevens is being provided the resources to support these students, so students that are on IEPs, is she being provided the support and the resources she needs to help them learn effectively. So Section 6 and 7 focus around the standard part. Candidates understand the importance of how to evaluate, develop, and implement systems of supervision, support, and evaluation designed to promote school improvement and student success. So the three options that I identified, option 1 is no action, so the principal could leave the evaluation as is and send it to the superintendent without additional conversations with Mrs. Stevens. Option 2 is a more liberal action, so the principal could have another experienced teacher complete peer observations to provide Mrs. Stevens with feedback. Based off the peer observation feedback, Mrs. Stevens can engage in professional learning to help her address the feedback. The principal can use the feedback from these observations, his observations, the peer observations, and Mrs. Stevens follow up on the feedback given to help determine the evaluation submitted to the superintendent and whether or not to recommend Mrs. Stevens rehire. And then option 3 is the principal could reach out to the superintendent, explain the situation, and request his observation of Mrs. Stevens, or that Mrs. Stevens be put on a professional learning plan to determine renewal or non-renewal of her contract. So Section 7 focused on evaluating these different options. So option 1 pros include that the situation is out of the principal's hand and that he's followed the protocol. Option 1 cons, there's little to no growth opportunity for Mrs. Stevens. Mrs. Stevens could follow up in court regarding her non-renewal. A positive working relationship between Mrs. Stevens and the principal has been damaged, and Mrs. Stevens will not have the opportunity for rehire. Option 2 pros include another observer is involved and a peer will be less intimidating during evaluation. Mrs. Stevens is provided a professional learning opportunity and follow-up. Mrs. Stevens could still be rehired. The principal's relationship with Mrs. Stevens is salvageable. And then option 2 cons, the deadline for teacher evaluations is approaching, therefore the principal may need to request an extension if possible for Mrs. Stevens. And the principal may be investing too much time into this situation. Option 3 pros include that another observer is involved, being the superintendent. Mrs. Stevens is provided a professional learning plan, and Mrs. Stevens could still be rehired. Some of the option 3 cons include the superintendent observing may be more intimidating than the principal. Mrs. Stevens may not be receptive to the professional learning plan, and the principal may be investing too much time into the situation. Section 8 focuses on demonstrating the capacity to 1. Observe teaching in a variety of classrooms, 2. Gather and analyze district policies on instructional expectations, 3. Provide teaching staff with actionable feedback to support improvement, and 4. Develop a system for monitoring whether supervision and evaluation strategies promote improvement. And that is why I chose the second option. It provides Mrs. Stevens with the opportunity to be observed by a peer, receive feedback, engage in professional learning, and show progress in areas of need. I believe it would be important to share the situation with the superintendent because of the approaching teacher evaluation deadline. In my opinion, this approach is the most reasonable and benefits and considers all stakeholders. Section 9 focuses on candidates using their understanding and capacity to undertake and implement this work into a school setting or within a school setting. So, implementing the decision. Imagine implementing the decision. Implementation. First, I will share the situation with the superintendent, request additional time for Mrs. Stevens' evaluation. Next, I will discuss with Mrs. Stevens the plan and positives to this choice. Then I will consult a mentor teacher to observe and provide feedback to Mrs. Stevens at least twice. Based on that feedback, Mrs. Stevens will engage in professional learning. Both the mentor teacher and I will observe Mrs. Stevens following the professional learning to determine if progress has been made. Depending on the follow-up observations, I will determine if Mrs. Stevens should be recommended for rehire or not. So some of the likely outcomes include that Mrs. Stevens engages in professional learning and makes progress. Mrs. Stevens does not engage or accept feedback and does not make progress. Or Mrs. Stevens engages in professional learning but does not make progress. Some of the consequences of this decision would be that too much time is being invested in the situation. If Mrs. Stevens does not improve, her students' education may be suffering. Plan B. If this plan does not work and Mrs. Stevens does not improve or the superintendent does not grant a time extension for Mrs. Stevens' evaluation, I think it's best to submit the original evaluation as is. So my personal reflection on this assignment. This assignment gave me the opportunity to put into practice the content and standards that were covered in the modules throughout this course. I learned of the importance of weighing pros and cons of different options in order to provide all stakeholders with the best possible outcome. This assignment impacts my future as a school leader because I feel better equipped to address situations like the one in this case study. I will be able to use what I have learned to make sure teachers are provided actionable feedback in order to grow professionally and set them up for success in the classroom. Thank you so much. I enjoyed this class.